The dust was a living thing, a fine red powder that coated the tongue, bit at the eyes, and settled in the lines of a man's soul. It rose from the cracked earth in lazy plumes with every step of Caleb Thorne's worn-out boots, a constant, gritty reminder of the land's indifference. Heat shimmered above the plains and waves, distorting the distant, bruised purple line of the mountains until they looked like a sleeping beast's spine. The silence here was not an absence of sound, but a presence, a heavy blanket woven from the drone of insects and the sigh of a wind that carried no relief, only more dust. This was his kingdom, 160 acres of stubborn dirt and defiance, purchased with the ghosts of his past and paid for daily in sweat. Caleb stood on the porch of his small, sturdy cabin, a structure he had raised with his own hands, log by defiant log. His face was a road map of every hardship the sun and sorrow had etched upon it. He was a man built of the same unyielding material as the land itself. Broad in the shoulder, lean in the waist, with hands that were calloused maps of labor. His solitude was a fortress he had built around a core of old pain, its walls high and its gates long rusted shut. He was expecting the weekly supply wagon from Harmony Creek, and on it, a solution, a practical solution to a practical problem. The advertisement had been blunt, devoid of romance. Sturdy woman of good character sought for partnership in Prairie Homestead. Hard work guaranteed. Passage provided. He expected someone wide-hipped and strong-armed, a woman from the old country with hands as tough as his own, who understood the brutal arithmetic of survival. When the wagon finally crested the rise, trailing its signature cloud of red earth, Caleb's gaze narrowed. It juddered to a halt, the driver offering a weary nod before climbing down to unload a crate of salt and a sack of flour. But there was another passenger, a woman. She descended from the wagon, not with the heavy, grounded step of a farm wife, but with a quiet, almost weightless grace that seemed entirely alien to this place. She was small, delicate as a desert bloom, her frame lost in a simple but well-made dark blue dress that was already filmed with the ubiquitous dust. Her hair was the color of polished jet, pulled back in a severe knot, and her face was a mask of calm composure, her dark eyes taking in the vast, empty expanse without a flicker of dismay. She was Chinese. The realization hit Caleb not with the force of a blow, but with the cold, sinking certainty of a colossal mistake. This was not the sturdy German or stoic Swede he had envisioned. This was a porcelain doll set down in a blacksmith's forge. The agent in the city had swindled him. He felt a hot surge of anger, a familiar and unwelcome companion. The driver, a man named Jed who knew better than to linger in Caleb's orbit, simply grunted, tipped his hat, and climbed back onto his seat, leaving the woman standing beside a single, small wooden trunk. She held a folded piece of paper in her hand, offering it to Caleb as if it were a sacred text. He took the paper from her, his calloused fingers brushing against hers. Her skin was cool, despite the oppressive heat. The document was a marriage contract, filled out in a lupin, elegant script that mocked the harshness of its surroundings. Her name was listed as Mei Lin. His own name was there, a crude approximation of his signature likely forged by the agency. He looked from the paper to her face. She said something, her voice soft, the words foreign and musical, but her meaning was lost to him. He shook his head, a short, sharp gesture of negation. He wanted to shout, to send her back, to curse the faceless agent who had taken his money and sent him this complication. But the wagon was already a diminishing shape on the horizon. its dust trail a fading signature of abandonment. Caleb Thorne felt the weight of her presence like a stone in his gut. His initial frustration had curdled into a grim, silent resignation. The wagon was gone, a speck of dust swallowed by the horizon's shimmering heat. The next one was not due for a month, a lifetime in the suffocating proximity of a stranger. He gestured curtly toward the cabin, a silent, ungracious invitation. There was no other choice. The sky was already beginning to bruise in the west, and the air had grown heavy, pregnant with the metallic scent of an approaching storm. To leave her outside would be a death sentence, and whatever else he was, Caleb was not a man who left people to die. Mei Lin followed him, her steps light on the hard-packed earth. She did not speak, her silence a mirror of his own. Inside, the cabin was a testament to a solitary man's life, functional, sparse, and bearing the faint, layered scents of gun oil, wood smoke, and old leather. A stone hearth dominated one wall, a simple table and 2 chairs sat in the center, and a narrow cot was pushed against the far wall. It was a space built for one, for survival, not for sharing. She placed her small trunk by the door, her movements precise and contained, as if she were trying to take up as little space as possible in his world. Caleb threw a few more logs onto the fire, the crackle and hiss a welcome intrusion into the thick silence. He pointed to the cot. "You," he said, the single word rough from disuse. He would take the floor. The storm broke that night, a furious tantrum of nature that rattled the very bones of the cabin. Wind howled like a hungry wolf around the eaves, and rain lashed against the single-glass window pane in sheets. Thunder cracked overhead, a sound so violent it seemed to split the sky in two. Through it all, Caleb lay on his bedroll by the fire, listening. He listened for any sound from her, a gasp of fear, a sob of despair. There was nothing, only the steady, quiet rhythm of her breathing, a calm island in the heart of the tempest. He found it unsettling. This place could break a strong man. It should have terrified a woman like her. Yet she met the world's fury with an unnerving stillness. The dawn came gray and weeping, the storm having moved on, leaving a sodden, transformed landscape in its wake. The creek that bisected his property was a raging, muddy torrent, and a section of his northern fence line, the one that kept his small herd from wandering into the canyons, had been torn down by a flash flood. He pulled on his boots, his mind already on the long, grueling day of repairs ahead. As he moved to the door, he saw her. She was already awake, dressed, her hair neatly combed. She had a pot of water boiling over the fire and was carefully measuring out ground coffee from his own dwindling supply. She looked at him, then at the pot, a silent question in her eyes. He gave a curt nod, surprised despite himself. He spent the morning in the thick, cloying mud, wrestling with split-rail timbers and taut wire. His muscles burned, his hands were raw, and the work was slow and infuriating. He had expected to return to the cabin to find her sitting uselessly, another problem to be solved. Instead, the scent of stew met him 50 yards from the door. Inside, the small space was transformed. His chaotic mess of tools and gear had been tidied. A patch on his work shirt, one he had been meaning to fix for months, was now a line of impossibly neat small stitches. A stew of salted pork and beans simmered on the hearth, and a loaf of passable-looking bread was cooling on the table. He stood there, dripping mud onto the floor she had swept clean, utterly dumbfounded. She ladled the stew into a bowl and set it before him without a word. He ate, the food warming him from the inside out. It was simple fare, but it was seasoned with a skill he could not comprehend. He looked at her hands as she washed the pot. They were slender, but not the soft, useless hands of a city lady. The knuckles were a little red, the fingertips showing the faintest signs of calluses, not from an axe handle, but from a needle, perhaps, or something else entirely. He had judged her by her size, by the delicate arch of her brow, and he had been wrong. She was not fragile. She was efficient, resilient, a quiet, unyielding force. A few days later, one of his calves took sick. It was a familiar, dreaded ailment, a fever that burned hot and fast, leaving the animal listless and refusing water. He had seen it before, and it almost always ended one way. He tried the usual remedies, forcing water and mash down its throat, but the calf only weakened. He had resigned himself to losing it when Mei Lin approached the small pen. She watched the calf for a long time, her gaze analytical and intense. Then she walked away, not toward the cabin, but toward the overgrown banks of the swollen creek. She returned an hour later, her apron full of strange leaves and roots he did not recognize. She worked at the table, crushing the plants with a rock, mixing them with hot water and a little flour to create a thick, pungent-smelling paste. Caleb watched her with deep skepticism, a part of him wanting to tell her to stop wasting her time. But he said nothing. He had run out of his own ideas. She approached the sick calf, her movements slow and soothing. She spoke to it in her own language, a low, melodic murmur, as she gently applied the poultice to the animal's hot muzzle and chest. For 3 days she tended to the calf, reapplying the paste, coaxing it to drink a broth she made from boiled herbs. On the 4th morning, Caleb went out to the pen expecting to find a body to drag away. Instead, the calf was standing. It was wobbly, uncertain on its feet, but it was standing, and it was drinking from the water trough. He stared, unable to process the sight. He turned to look at the cabin, where Mei Lin was hanging his washed shirt on a line. She met his gaze, and for the first time, he saw something other than placid composure in her eyes. It was a quiet flicker of pride, a small, dignified acknowledgment of her own competence. In that moment, his perception of her shifted irrevocably. She was not a liability he was stuck with. She was an asset he did not understand. A fragile truce, born of mud and medicine, began to settle over the homestead, as quiet and profound as the vast prairie sky. This new, fragile peace was a thing of silence and shared space. Caleb found himself observing her, learning the rhythm of her days. She moved through his world with a quiet purpose that began to impose a subtle order on his own chaotic existence. His meals were regular, his cabin was clean, his mending was done before he even noticed a tear. She asked for nothing, demanded nothing, yet she gave a sense of stability he had not realized he lacked. He began to leave a portion of the garden for her, and soon, small, unfamiliar green shoots began to poke through the soil. He watched her work, her hands deft and knowing, and the respect that had been planted by the saved calf began to take root and grow. He found himself thinking less about the month he had to endure, and more about the strange, quiet woman who had filled the empty spaces in his home. The intrusion, when it came, was as loud and unwelcome as a gunshot in a library. 3 riders crested the hill, not with the weary plod of a supply wagon, but with the arrogant swagger of men who own the ground they rode on. At their head was Silas Croft, a man whose wealth was as vast as his conscience was small. Croft was a blight on the landscape, a man who bought or broke whatever stood in his way. He had been trying to get his hands on Caleb's quarter section for 2 years, not for the land itself, but for the creek that ran through it, the only reliable water source for miles. Croft reined in his horse, his gaze sweeping over the homestead with dismissive contempt before it landed on May Lynn, who was tending her small garden. A slow, unpleasant smirk spread across his fleshy face. His eyes, small and porcine, raked over her, stripping her down with a casual brutality. "Well, Thorne," he boomed, his voice dripping with condescension, "I see you've finally bought yourself some company. A bit small for farm work, ain't she? What did she cost you?" His 2 hired men chuckled, a harsh, ugly sound that scraped against the prairie silence. Caleb felt a cold, familiar rage coil in his belly. He stepped off the porch, placing himself between Croft and May Lynn. His hand did not go to the Colt peacemaker on his hip, but it rested near a silent promise. "State your business, Croft." Caleb's voice was low, flat, and dangerous. He ignored the jibe, refused to give it the dignity of a response. To acknowledge the insult would be to acknowledge Croft's right to make it. Croft's smirk widened. He was enjoying this. "My business is the same as it's always been. Your stubbornness. I'm making you my final offer. $500 for this scrap of dirt. That's more than it's worth, and you know it." He leaned forward in his saddle, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial sneer. "Enough to set you and your souvenir up somewhere else." "The land's not for sale," Caleb said. The words were stones dropped into a deep well. The false bonhomie vanished from Croft's face, replaced by a mask of raw avarice. "Everything is for sale, Thorne. You just haven't realized it yet." He gestured vaguely upstream with a gloved hand. "That creek of yours. It originates on my property. It would be a terrible shame if something were to obstruct the flow. A man could get thirsty out here. An animal could die." The threat was naked, ugly, and delivered with the absolute certainty of a man who had never been denied what he wanted. He spat a brown stream of tobacco juice near Caleb's boot, a final act of desecration. Then he wheeled his horse around, his men falling in behind him, and they rode away, leaving a trail of dust and poisoned silence in their wake. Caleb stood there for a long time after they were gone, the dust settling around him. The threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating. He turned to look at May Lynn. She had not moved from her garden, but her hands were still, and she was watching him. Her face was as calm as ever, but her eyes held a new light, a shared understanding of the storm that was no longer on the horizon, but directly upon them. The fragile truce was over. They were now allies, bound not by a piece of paper, but by a common enemy. The threat became reality less than a week later. The creek, the lifeblood of Caleb's land, began to shrink. The cheerful gurgle that was the constant background music to his life dwindled to a pathetic trickle, then to a series of stagnant, muddy pools. The vibrant green along its banks began to fade to a sickly yellow-brown. It was a slow, deliberate murder of his land, and Caleb felt each dying blade of grass like a cut on his own skin. His small herd of cattle stood by the dry creek bed, lowing mournfully, their confusion and thirst a constant, agonizing accusation. A desperate, primal rage consumed Caleb. His entire life he had met threats with force. It was the only language he truly trusted. His instinct screamed at him to ride out, to face Croft, to settle this with the cold, hard finality of iron and lead. He spent an evening cleaning his rifle, the methodical, repetitive motions of oiling the steel and checking the action a grim ritual of preparation. His mind was a maelstrom of violent solutions, each one leading to a bloody, inevitable conclusion. He would lose everything, one way or another, either the land to thirst or his freedom to a hangman's rope. It was a choice between two kinds of death. He was sitting at the table, the rifle laid out before him, when Mei Lin approached. She placed a lit lantern on the table, its golden glow pushing back the encroaching shadows. She did not look at the gun. Instead, she laid a small, leather-bound ledger beside it. It was his father's old account book, a dusty relic he had tossed into a crate and forgotten. She opened it. The pages were no longer filled with his father's sprawling, barely legible script. They were now covered in her own writing, columns of neat, precise figures and elegant, flowing characters he could not read. Next to the ledger, she unrolled a piece of paper. It was a map of his own property, but rendered with a detail and accuracy that stunned him. She had drawn the creek, the fence lines, the slight rises and falls of the terrain, all from memory and observation. Her slender finger traced the path of the Dine Creek back to its source on Croft's land. Then she did something unexpected. She tapped a section of the map far to the west on his own property, a place marked by a series of low, rocky hills. She looked at him, her eyes dark and serious in the lamplight, and spoke a single, clear word in English. Water. He stared at her, then at the map. He had always considered that patch of land useless, a rocky spine that was good for nothing but rattlesnakes. But she tapped the map again, more insistently, and then pointed to the ledger. She had been doing more than just keeping his accounts. She had been studying. She had somehow pieced together the history of this land from the disorganized pile of deeds, receipts, and letters he had inherited. She had found references in old survey notes to a natural spring in those hills, one that his own father had dismissed as unreliable and had never bothered to develop. He spent the rest of that night not in a haze of fury, but in a state of focused disbelief. She guided him through the papers, pointing out phrases and figures. Her English was broken, a collection of single words and gestures, but her meaning was shockingly clear. She was showing him a different path, one that did not lead to a gunfight. She was showing him a way to fight back not with violence, but with knowledge and hard work. For the first time, he saw the keen, analytical mind behind her quiet facade. This was her battlefield, a world of paper and ink, of angles and elevations. He had to make a choice. He could follow the familiar, destructive path of his anger, or he could trust her. He could trust this quiet, foreign woman who had saved his calf with weeds and was now proposing to save his ranch with a forgotten map and a dusty ledger. He looked from the cold steel of the rifle to the warm, intelligent light in her eyes. He slowly, deliberately, began to reassemble the gun, not to use it, but to put it away. He picked up the lantern and a shovel. "Show me," he said. The two words felt monumental, a surrender and a beginning all at once. Their partnership, forged in the crucible of Croft's greed, was no longer one of circumstance. It was one of choice. They walked out into the night together, two small figures against a vast darkness, heading toward a sliver of hope hidden in the rocks. The days that followed were a blur of grueling, shared labor. They worked from the first hint of dawn until the last vestiges of light faded from the sky. Caleb, armed with a pickaxe and shovel, attacked the rocky ground she had indicated with a focused ferocity. The work was brutal, punishing. Rocks splintered, dirt flew, and sweat poured from him, carving clean rivulets through the grime on his face. He was a man possessed, driven by the quiet, unshakable certainty he saw in her eyes every time she brought him a canteen of water. Mei Lin did not dig, but her work was no less vital. She meticulously cleared the area, studied the rock formations, and analyzed the soil. She seemed to be reading the land itself, searching for signs that only she could understand. In the evenings, while he collapsed onto his cot, muscles screaming in protest, she would be back at the table with the lantern, poring over the old documents. She was piecing together a legal argument, a defense built on the shaky foundations of territorial law and forgotten contractual clauses. She was building a fortress of paper and ink, while he built one of rock and earth. One sweltering afternoon, the head of his pickaxe struck something different. Not the solid, jarring crunch of rock, but a dull, wet thud. He cleared the dirt away with his hands and saw it. Dark, damp soil. A frantic energy seized him. He dug faster, ignoring the blisters on his hands, the ache in his back. An hour later, he had cleared a small basin, and at the bottom of it, a tiny pool of water was slowly, miraculously gathering. It was not a gushing spring, but it was water. It was life. He fell to his knees, plunging his hands into the cool, muddy water, a choked sound escaping his throat. Mei Lin stood at the edge of the pit, a rare, small smile gracing her lips. It was a shared victory, more profound than any he had ever known alone. With the immediate threat of thirst abated, their focus shifted. Mei Lin had assembled a small, damning portfolio of evidence. She had discovered that the original survey of Croft's land, the one upon which his water rights were based, was fraudulent. It had been filed by a cousin of his, a disgraced surveyor who had left the territory under a cloud of suspicion years ago. The document was a house of cards, and she had just found the bottom one. Their path was clear. They had to go to town, to Sheriff Brody. The ride to Harmony Creek was tense. Caleb rode with his rifle in its scabbard, his Colt heavy on his hip. Mei Lin sat beside him on the wagon seat, her back straight, the precious documents wrapped in oilcloth and tucked into a small satchel. The town was a dusty collection of false-fronted buildings huddled along a single main street. As they pulled up in front of the sheriff's office, Caleb saw them. Croft and his two thugs were lounging outside the saloon, as if they had been waiting. Croft pushed himself off the hitching post, his face a mask of smug arrogance. "Come to beg, Thorne? The price has gone up." His eyes flickered to Mei Lin, his lip curling in a sneer. "Maybe your little pet can offer a down payment." Before Caleb could react, before the red mist of fury could descend, Mei Lin slid gracefully from the wagon. She walked directly toward Silas Croft, stopping a few feet from him. She did not flinch under his hateful gaze. She simply looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Croft," she said. Her voice was not the soft, hesitant murmur he was used to. It was clear, crisp, and carried the weight of authority. Her English was perfect, without a trace of an accent. The pidgin she had used, the quiet deference, it had all been a shield, a form of camouflage she had worn to survive in a hostile world. Caleb stared, his mind reeling. The whole town seemed to hold its breath. According to Territorial Statute 4, subsection B, she continued, her voice cutting through the thick silence, all water rights are predicated on land surveys filed and certified by a licensed territorial agent. The survey for your property, filed 11 years ago by a Mr. Alistair Finch, was invalidated 2 years prior to its filing when Mr. Finch's license was permanently revoked for fraud. She recited the dates, the file numbers, the legal precedents, her memory a flawless repository of facts. She was not just citing the law, she was wielding it like a sword. Croft's face went from smug to confused, then to a mottled, apoplectic purple. He was a man used to fighting with fists and fear, not with statutes and subsections. He was being dismantled, piece by piece, in the middle of the street by a woman he had dismissed as a trinket. That's lies, a trick, he stammered, his bravado crumbling. The official revocation is on file in the territorial capital, May Lynn stated calmly, and a copy is in the possession of Sheriff Brody. Your claim to the water in that creek is, and has always been, illegal. She had unmasked him completely, not just as a bully, but as a common cheat. The power he wielded was an illusion, and she had just torn the curtain away for everyone to see. Sheriff Brody stepped out of his office, a file in his hand and a grimly satisfied look on his weary face. He had been listening. "She's right, Silas. I just received the telegram. It's over." Enraged, humiliated, and cornered, Croft did the only thing a man like him could do. He lunged for his gun, but he was slow, his movements clumsy with fury. Caleb was not. The world narrowed to a single, sharp point of focus, the scent of dust, the glint of sun on metal, the feel of the worn walnut grip in his palm. The Colt Peacemaker was in his hand before Croft's pistol had even cleared its holster. A single shot rang out, deafening in the sudden silence. It was not a killing shot. Caleb's bullet struck the gun from Croft's hand, sending it spinning into the dust. He had chosen precision over lethality, control over vengeance. He had fought her way first and his way second. The combination was unbeatable. Croft stood there, clutching his stinging, empty hand, his face a ruin of shock and defeat. His reign was over, not just legally, but in the eyes of the community that had feared him for so long. As the sheriff moved in to arrest him, Caleb's gaze found May Lynn's. She was looking at him, her calm facade finally broken by a flicker of something. Relief, respect, a connection that ran deeper than words. The immediate aftermath was quiet. They returned to the ranch as the sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet. Caleb had a shallow graze along his forearm where a splinter from Croft's shattered pistol had struck him. It was nothing, but May Lynn insisted on tending to it. She cleaned the wound with a quiet efficiency, her touch gentle but firm. They sat at the table in the warm glow of the lantern, the silence between them no longer a void, but a comfortable, shared space filled with unspoken understanding. He was not just looking at her anymore, he was finally seeing her. The brilliant, resilient, courageous woman who had been there all along, hidden in plain sight. Weeks melted into a month, and the land began to heal. The creek, freed from Croft's illegal dam, once again flowed clear and steady. The grass along its banks returned to a vibrant green, and the cattle grew fat and content. Silas Croft was a ghost, a bad memory tied up in legal battles in a town far away, his power broken forever. The peace that settled over the homestead was profound, earned not just by defeating an enemy, but by building something new in its place. The ranch was no longer just his, it was theirs. A new rhythm established itself, one of quiet partnership. He worked the land, his strength now guided by her foresight. She managed the books, her sharp intellect turning his hard work into real prosperity. They built a small shelf for her books, which now included not just legal texts, but volumes of poetry and history. They expanded the garden, a patchwork of his hardy vegetables and her fragrant, unfamiliar herbs. It was a tangible symbol of their two worlds intertwining, taking root in the same soil and thriving. One evening, they sat on the porch, a comfortable silence between them as they watched the stars begin to prick the deep indigo of the twilight sky. The air was cool, smelling of sagebrush and damp earth. Caleb had been repairing a piece of tack, his hands moving with practiced ease. He set it aside and went back into the cabin. When he returned, he was holding the original marriage contract, the piece of paper that had been the source of his initial anger and confusion. He placed it on the small crate that served as their table, smoothing out the creases. He looked at her, his gaze direct and stripped of all its former defenses. The fortress he had built around himself was gone, dismantled brick by her quiet strength and unwavering dignity. He had been a man living in the ruins of his past, and she had shown him how to build a future. He pushed the paper toward her, his calloused finger tapping his own name. "This," he said, his voice a low rumble, earnest and sure. "This stands." It was not a declaration of love in the way the poets wrote about. It was something more solid, more real. It was a statement of fact, a promise of permanence, an acknowledgement of everything they had built and everything they would become. It was a commitment as unshakable as the mountains on the horizon. Mei Lin looked from his face to the document, then out at the vast, peaceful land that stretched before them. It was no longer a harsh, alien place, but a home, their home. A small, hopeful smile touched her lips. She reached out and placed her hand over his on the paper, a silent, binding acceptance. "Yes," she said, her voice soft but absolute. "It does."